I'm Juan Carlos. I started out as a documentary filmmaker. I transformed into a product leader. And then I'm probably known in this space for having built an iOS app from scratch, having no programming experience whatsoever. So it's been an exciting time for me as I've learned to be able to create and build these things for myself in a new way that allows me to do things that I've never been able to do before.
I believe you're a photographer by training. Is that correct?
A filmmaker. So I went to NYU film for undergrad and I directed a couple of motion pictures. So I was there at NYU from 1999 to 2003. And then I graduated from there and I went on to direct my first picture in 2008. And then that was a documentary called Second Skin. It was about online video games like World of Warcraft, EverQuest, Second Life. And it was about folks who are essentially either deeply embedded with one foot in the real world, one foot in the virtual world, or folks who had been through transformative journeys of their own, essentially had a debilitating disease. He was handicapped, had to be in a wheelchair, had very little ability to use much more than his hands to type. And he found sort of a voice in the virtual space. So it was a really cool documentary that was a lot of fun to make. And I think it actually lent itself to some of what we ended up or we're ending up talking about today. I do a lot of photography, but it's mostly as a result of the filmmaking.
You've said to us privately that you've had for a long time this desire to build an app. Where did that desire come from? Tell us a little bit about your desire to build something totally different from a documentary and what both inspired it, but also what kept you from actually manifesting it for a number of years.
So the first app that I wanted to make was a list app for myself because I was going, have all these lists. I had started a website at the time called Pop 10. It was a pop culture blog, but it was all top 10 lists. I'm going, I need something to codify this and make it something bigger. And so started to, play around and mock things up, tried to get an engineer or actually three to help build it. And it went like this far along before, one of them moved across the country, the other one goes somewhere else. And it just kept on losing its thing. So year after year, I'm trying to figure out how am I going to make this thing? And, fast forward, I started working in an iOS app called Onward for Anti-Addiction, and I became the director of product there. So I started to be able to deeply influence the way that we were building this app, started to think about things in terms of minimum viable product and, simple stuff, but it was building blocks into becoming someone who's a product manager. I kept on wanting to build something. I kept on at first it was a list app, and then I wanted to build this application for mental models eventually. And I wanted to help get that out there. And, I'd get some interest, but not enough. I
You mean, and
learned,
by some interest, you mean from collaborators or people you
yeah, from
realize
collaborators that
that,
would help me. I kept on going the route of, hey, I'm not the technical found
right.
card. Comes out and you go,
At
okay.
what point did you realize, or what happened? What did you see in the world where you said, this could be my collaborator?
When ChatGPT 3.5 comes out, it's one of those moments where everyone starts looking at this thing, right? And I was the same. So November 22, I started looking at it the same way everyone does. And I think I just noticed, wow, this thing is amazing. And I was using it just to do basics. And I think I realized pretty quickly that other people thought it was a novelty. And I immediately took it very seriously, where a lot of the people that I care about the most have some of the deepest thoughts around uh, all kinds of subjects go, oh, yeah, no, I gave it a shot. And I was going, I'm using this thing every minute of every day and soaking it in. I love this thing. This is such an interesting format. It's so knowledgeable. It's a Swiss Army knife for doing anything.
Well, so this is interesting because we see this bifurcation oftentimes where some folks show up to ChatGPT and go, it's not that good and give up. And then others show up and they have their worlds transformed. What did you see, or what can you tell us about, and maybe contrast your own experience with some friends who tried it and were like, there's nothing really to it. What was different about your experience, or what enabled you to persist perhaps in the face of some of those early misfires and dead ends?
Such a good question, because I often come back to this around who is ChatGPT a fit for versus not, and why do they care about this application versus those that don't. And for the people that do, it's such an obvious duh kind of moment, right? Where you go, if I'm not doing this, I am going to be left behind. If I'm not doing this, I'm not finding the most value in what is, I would consider, the most valuable software, just LLMs in general, not specifically ChatGPT, but obviously GPT is the preeminent version of that, but just the unique power of those. And so when I think about what are the things I find valuable about it that aren't true about someone else, I wonder about productivity. So I'm a huge productivity nerd, and it's an accelerant. So it's one of those things where I go, well, it could take me 45 minutes to do X, but with this, I could do it in 10. Oh, I could write a 10-page paper in maybe 4 or 5 days of deep work, or I could write it in an evening. And so those are considerations for me about, hey, these things are immediately interesting and valuable to me.
Do you think you have, I mean, obviously I know you're right about mental models. Do you have a mental model for when to use ChatGPT and when not to? And the reason why I'm asking is because my sense is that a lot of people that are very efficient of using ChatGPT kind of almost have like a brain trigger that if they're about to do something or anything, then they kind of go there first. And other people just never have that. And so therefore it becomes one of those things where they go like, oh, I probably should use it more, but don't get around to do it. Do you have like a mental model for how to think about it or become better using it?
So one thing I notice with folks who don't use it is they expect the answer to come out correctly the first time. And then when it doesn't, it's a question of, oh, well, this thing doesn't work that well. You go, well, you didn't ask, one, questions to frame the problem. Two, you may not have asked the right kinds of framing. So when you frame a project for someone that you're going to give this to, and you say, let's delegate this over here, right? So you're a manager at a company and you need to delegate something. You're not going to give them 2 sentences, say, hey, go on your way. And yet with a AI, I see a lot of folks try to input a prompt that is much less than what you would expect out of a human to then calibrate them and have them move much slower than the AI would anyway toward a goal. So what's the better framing? How do you deliver more instruction? And how do you help them understand the way in which you need them to respond? And all of that can be built in, right? So I think you see a lot of weak prompting, not that it's incorrect, but that they aren't delivering the full concept or idea in the first place to get them started. And then I think the want is for a full response at the start rather than a framing and a structure. So I think when we start, it's more about framing and questions around structure of response than it is about.
Yeah, you know what? I heard something interesting the other day. Ethan Mollick, who's a professor at Wharton, who's written a book that's coming out shortly about working with AI. One thing that he said, which I hadn't heard before, but I found very interesting, was that developers aren't the best users of AI. Actually, the best users of AI are teachers because they're really good at talking to humans. And developers actually, there's been early use cases because they're so specific about what their criteria are, and because software development is, debugging and implementing code is like a super fast feedback loop. So it's become a, kind of a quintessential use case. But he said, if you just compare people types of who's actually well suited to use ChatGPT, someone who knows how to talk to people is much better equipped to leverage ChatGPT than someone who knows how to talk to technology. I found that pretty fascinating. I think it gets, Juan Carlos, to your point that I love that example. You'd never give it. And then when it doesn't, we go, oh, it's no better than my intern. It's like, well, you haven't really given it a chance. So tell us a little bit about how you built your iPhone app with ChatGPT. Because I think a lot of folks, they tell us, first of all, your credentials. I think there's a single word for your credentials, right? Zero, in terms of, technical know-how. So how did you go from somebody with basically zero technical know-how into fully functional iPhone app in the Apple Store? Walk us through that journey, and
Yeah.
where we might interrupt a couple of times.
I'll preface it with I hacked around on HTML and CSS like any other human when you're doing a WordPress site. So I had that like sliver. So I don't want to be remiss and say that I had like absolute zero, but maybe like 1 out of 10, and zero in terms of programming, developing with code. Certainly I had never coded any application using Swift UI and build an app. I've never used Xcode for that method. So all of that was brand new. I'd been able to look at engineers who had done that when I was building an iOS app for Onward, but I'd never legitimately been inside the bricks of it myself. And so I'd had this idea in my mind for a little while to make a mental models app. And I thought, well, I've always wanted to build my own iOS app, but it's completely out of reach. And then, come, I believe it's March of 23, I'm going to if I don't make this thing right now, because you were seeing people just building stuff immediately, right? So January to March, it felt like fervor to me. You had people showing, hey, I can do this, I can do that. I was so rocked at that stage. I thought the world was just in this change state, which it is, but
where were you seeing this? Were you seeing this on Twitter, where
this was
people are just
building? Everyone ditches Twitter because it went to absolute insanity. But it was right at that moment where I think it was peak AI Twitter. And I'm going, oh my gosh, I am missing out. I am losing my mind right now. This thing is the future. And I think it led me to want to build quick. And so I was getting pushed to go, okay, do something. And then there's one tweet by this guy, Morton Just, who I don't know, he was writing about AI at the time. He probably still is, but I saw this one tweet where he describes making an app in 2 nights, and that he's, an engineer, and he shows the prompt that he used in a video just to get started. And I went, that's it. I'm going to try. And so I looked at that prompt and tried to rewrite it, and it didn't work just out of the gate for some reason, because he wasn't building it as an iOS app. He was building something else. So I went, okay, let me see if GPT can literally tell me how to start. How would I build an iOS app? What software would I use? Why would I use it? Which method is the right one if I'm trying to build something simple? And so it started to deliver on structure. I think I learned structure early on to ask, hey, what are the different ways that this could go? It told me what to do. I downloaded Xcode on its behalf, and I really started to think about it that way.
Okay, so just in case someone missed that, on its behalf, what do you mean? What is on its behalf mean, and what do you mean that you started thinking about it that way?
Right. So one, it's a collaborator, but it's a much smarter collaborator than I am. And I am leading our discussion in the sense that directionally I'm providing the way in which we're fundamentally doing something, but it is the mensch wizard thing, magician, that is essentially saying, hey, do this, not that, do this, not that, go here, go there. I can't go through the woods alone without a map. I possibly could, but I probably get stuck somewhere and starve, right? And then suddenly there's this guide that's going to get you through the woods the whole way, and you're going to get to the other side somehow because this thing has the capacity to do that. And so, I started to think of it as my best friend, ChatGPT. Like, this thing is a buddy that's helping me out. It's a smart engineer that is willing to take time with me in a way that no engineer ever has. Mostly because they want to take it back. I mean, any human, they go, hey, what do you want? I'll go do something. I'll come back and show you the fruits of my labor. And that's the general way in which every working relationship tends to work. You have yourself as a creator, or in this case, a founder that's a creator, but is going to say, hey, can you go do something? And in this scenario, it's well, you're going to have to do it yourself, but I'm going to show you every step of the way, as long as you're willing to take some detours with me too. So we took a lot of detours together, but the dynamic and the reason why I say at its behalf is because I wouldn't have made those choices. I was asking it for the choices that it was then able to provide me, obviously via an LLM, the knowledge base that it has access to. And it's not magic because we know what it is, but it's magic, right? When you think about what it's capable of doing, even at this nascent state, it's absolute.
Can you tell us the first time, if you remember, what's the first time that you thought, I can't believe it did that?
So I'm big into self-development, self-growth, and mental models is a part of that, framing and understanding the world as a sort of layer, a base layer, right? And so I think one of the first things that I did was think about, hey, I'm in this situation. Can you describe to me via cognitive biases how I am or am not seeing something? I forget the exact words, but the description back was spot on. And I thought, this is a better version of what a therapist would be able to deliver to me off the cuff. Just full stop. I was in. And what are the cognitive biases that I am in as a result of the way that I'm writing this, right? So just here's a blob of text about what I'm going through.
Oh,
What do you
wow.
see?
Okay, so walk us through, if you're going to give a class to someone to try to replicate this experience. I'll say what I think I'm hearing, and then you just correct me as the teacher, okay? So I'm just your pupil. But what I'm hearing you say is, describe a scenario where you wonder what kind of cognitive biases are affecting your own thinking. Maybe it's a relationship issue or a work issue or whatever, but just blah, as you said, verbal vomit into ChatGPT, pardon me, and then ask ChatGPT to analyze the way I am talking about this issue for evidence of certain cognitive biases, and then describe what biases might be at play as evidenced by the way in which I'm speaking about the issue. Is that what you're saying?
Yes.
Well, and correct me. What did I get wrong, or what did I?
No, you did.
What are the cues, or what are the things to look for? Because I think this would be a fascinating exercise for everybody to do right now. It's like almost push pause on this episode, and then it's like, how do they know what to look for? Or is it just in your gut, or are there indications?
So think of it as almost, instead of journaling directly into a journal, you're going to voice over a challenging day as if you're journaling normally. You're going to be specific and explicit and honest and authentic about your feelings. And you choose to do that as a result of, hey, this is just me talking to myself, giving myself this information so that later on I can come back to it and potentially see 2020. And as a result of that, you're going to be able to find and come to new answers about yourself. There's less concern. You're not talking, even a therapist, sometimes you may say, hey, I don't know, I'm going to go there, right? You may not be, that another person is there, even if they're being non-judgmental and that's their job. There is still knowledge of, especially now that you've seen every other movie and show out there that shows therapists later on going like this crazy person, right? So there's judgment in any of these moments because we're human, right? But in this moment, you have this thing that is being completely non-judgmental, and you could be anybody. Obviously, you're not, because you've logged in and you basically have a full specific back to yourself, just in the sense of your freedom to speak to it and receive an answer, I think is unique in its semi-anonymity, which I know that's not true, but the feeling of it, the feeling tone that you have toward it and what it gives back, I think is one of, hey, I'm journalistic here. It's not going to have thoughts, emotions. It's not my sibling. It's not my best friend. It's not my wife. It's not any of these folks. So I can speak pretty clearly and tangibly to it and receive an answer that is, in many cases, not all, but in many cases, it's a lot better than what you could receive even from a fantastic therapist. I was thinking about Esther Perel, right? The fantastic psychologist or psychiatrist. And I've listened to a lot of her podcasts, and I was thinking it's not that different than receiving thoughts and advice from someone of that caliber. It's pretty close, especially if you give it the right kinds of information, then it'll spit back something that is going to help you.
I was going back to the iPhone app, and you mentioned something about being okay with it taking a few blind turns, so a blind, turn down to blind road. It resonates with me. I've tried a few times doing something with ChatGPT, and then suddenly we're at a dead end, like where it says something that didn't work or whatever. How do you kind of what's the equivalent of going a little bit back from the road and then trying to find a new?
It's hard, right? It's so hard because you're so frustrated. And I think so. One thing that I had to consistently tell myself is I wouldn't be this far if I didn't have this. So anytime I started to get into a zone of I'm just going to give up. There's no way for me to get past this. I go, I'm only this far along right now because this LLM has allowed me to find my way here in the first place. And that would give me pause, and I think would get my spirits back up somehow. It's the building blocks of any app. It's connecting different apparatus. So I'm connecting a database, I'm connecting these different things. And that's usually just challenging. It's the basic setup where there's not that many instructions available on Stack Overflow and things like that. So it's just challenging from my perspective to get things going. And so with GPT, I think it was one of those moments of, oh, hey, this thing is going to be able to tell me how to get it right. And so I thought, great. And then the first hurdle was I asked it to help me connect at that time I had a CSV, right, of this database for mental models. And so I thought, okay, well, I did the work of getting all the mental models I've written into what I think is a clean spreadsheet with the right column headers. And I want to put that into this iOS app. And it's trying to help me do that, right? And so fundamentally, I'm going, well, I keep on trying to connect it. I'm like, it's not working. It's not working. It's not working. And it just doesn't want to do what I want it to do. And then I took sort of 2 steps back. I think one thing is thinking about its first principles thinking, and I'm a huge junkie on mental models anyway. What are the truths? One basic building block is I need a database. 2, it can be really any database, right? And so when I started to think about it, I was going, well, I overfitted the thing in the first place, and I don't necessarily need to do it with a CSV. So there's a lot of trying to think about, hey, maybe I didn't ask the question in the right way in the first place. How do I ask a different question to then illuminate a different path forward? So that's when, and it sounds so simple, but when you're stuck, right? And so you're looking at the tree instead of the forest. So I then asked it, hey, what are the methods which I could use to create this database? It gave me 3 other methods. I asked it, which is the simplest method to do. It says, make this JSON file. I go, okay, great. So then I rebuilt.
One of the things that strikes me that I just want to call out here, I had never thought about it in quite this way until this conversation, is there is a profound tendency to want to give up. I would say perhaps I don't know if it's a cognitive bias. I'd be curious to, scan your mental models app for this. But I think that the human tendency to give up is, so for example, if we look back over the arc of your story, why did you never build an app before? Well, I don't have the technical ability, right? And then all of a sudden you get this amazing technical co-founder. Why are you tempted to quit every time? Well, because this is as far as I can get. And your simple flip of, I wouldn't be this far yet if it wasn't for that. Like, to me, what if I was starting fresh again today? I've noticed in my own kind of building with this, sometimes you get to the end of the day and you're just spent. The wrong conclusion at the end of the day is, I can't do anymore. The right conclusion is, maybe I need a break. And I think it's a profound realization that you have come to, which is, I don't have to quit.
So, Juan Carlos, let us just kind of make sure that we get it. If you're somebody who kind of goes, building an iPhone app with ChatGPT seems amazing, I'd like to do that. Haven't done it, what would be your kind of like few recommendations and maybe a few things that people should be aware of or avoid?
So one thing is stripping down to its most basic version at the start. And if you are in this space, you know about what an MVP is, but I think it's most important here when you're building something for yourself to say, hey, what is the absolute most basic version of this that I can build to begin? And then I can ladder on and make it more complex as it goes along. Community that is doing, user generated content, and I want to have all of the challenging interrelationships between users, et cetera. That in and of itself is going to ask a lot from you. I don't think it's outside the wheelhouse, but if it's your first time out, like it was for me, I was going, okay, I'm not even going to try to build a cloud data. I'm just going to make a local one that I'm going to install directly into the iOS app. How can I do that? And so questions about that early on are important. What is the simplest version? And you can ask GPT for it, right? I want to do filtering. I want to, create different kinds of views. I think there's different methods that you can go down with an iOS app, and some are just more complex than others, right? So I went basic every time, code it and do it via Swift UI, make all the UI Swift. Don't even do anything visual, right? So I chose against complexity every single time. And so I think that helps a lot when you're choosing and you're thinking about what can I do? What do I want to do? When I decided to make sort of a card swipe type of UI, that ended up being more challenging, but I really wanted it, and I wanted a light and dark mode. So there's pieces of that where I went, I'll just go for it and do something that may be unnecessary, but I wanted desperately because I knew if I wanted to use the app, I would want it to function in that way. But you don't necessarily need all those features. What are the unique and important features that are valuable to you that you want to see come to light, that you want to be able to then use, right? I think that's a big part of it too. It's how important is that application to you? So when you're thinking about choosing something to build, it should be something that's interesting and exciting for you, that if you saw it out in the world, you go, man, I really want that, right? I want to use it. So I think a bit of it for me is you're choosing something that is ultimately something you're deeply curious about and that you want to see.
And one thing I would say, just to be cheeky on behalf of ChatGPT, is when you think about the app that you envision, that is never the MVP, right? The app and the interaction and all the functionality that you envision is never the MVP. So listeners, if you just heard Juan Carlos's advice, he basically said, do the least possible and fulfill your wildest dreams. And if you find yourself going, wait, those are opposites. Exactly. That's the tension you're walking into right now if you don't do this. And the way to resolve it is right in the middle. What Juan Carlos said is, If you don't know what an MVP of your wildest dreams looks like, and you find yourself stuck there, that's the first conversation with ChatGPT.
And in some ways, it can be your product manager too, where it says, hey, help me understand what version 1 is here so that I can then start to align on what the next versions would be after that. And so it can help you understand what that phasing might look like so that you can build a more complex application, but you start with the bricks. And even that, I mean, if you've never built an iOS app before, like me, then part of it is you get to the finish line, you have an app, and then you have to put it on the app store. And that's its own wonderfully complex dance of crap that you have to deal with. It's challenging, right? You go online, you make your developer account, and you go, all right, well, where's the button to do the thing?
Yeah. Well, that brings us to a very natural kind of conclusion, either of the conversation or the conversation more broadly. But what's next for you? If you think about, okay, you've got to the finish line, if you're in the app store, is Juan Carlos now going to be working on the mental models app and pushing that forward? Or is Juan Carlos now a developer looking to develop other applications? How do you conceive of yourself, and how are you thinking about what's next, having now had this transformative learning experience?
Yeah, well, you and I met in what I think is part of the next step, which is I want to be able to query and think about how to help someone in decision making. And how do I do that at scale? Obviously, in part of my life, I'm a coach. And I think, how would I be able to deliver thinking and processes and these mental models, but more specifically, ways to potentially find your way through problems more easily? And so I've gravitated towards building more chatbots that can do that. So the chatbot GPT course that we both took, that was a way to then say, okay, I want to build a simple chatbot that I can make more complex, right? And so built that on Replit. I think we all did. And then started to see how I could make it more specific and nuanced in the way that it delivers responses and then continues to respond after someone asks a question that they might have. So it could be a personal, professional issue that they're going through. And how do I make a decision? And so how does it deliver mental models and then ultimately advice that would engage with someone directly? Because one thing that I think is tough about a mental models app is, first, you got to figure out, hey, what's a mental model? Then you look at the definition, then you have to imbibe it and understand it. You have to agree that it's important enough to matter. Clear thinking overall it's so simple to say, but it's challenging to actually put a emphasis on it in your life. I think there's a lot of ways that people position thought and thinking as a whole. And so, is there a more accessible way to be able to say, hey, this is going to give you the information you need, the way to frame it in your life in this moment? And I think I'm looking at and thinking about more of that. How do I take steps out of the process so that it's ultimately the most accessible? It may not end up being in GPT, or excuse me, it may not end up being a messaging bot on some website. Maybe it's text message, right? Hey, I'm just your buddy. Whenever you text me, I can help you out and give you some info on what you need. And so it could be as simple as that. We're just taking out more and more of the ways in which we get in front of ourselves. We block ourselves from succeeding, So how do we get out of our own way? And so that, I think that's where my focus is right now. It's how do I deliver an application that allows for folks to find and understand themselves better, faster, more easily, and make choices that are smarter and wiser and allow them to understand the constructs of why and how they might apply those if they forget in the future, right? So I think that's a little bit of where my head's at in terms of, hey, it's great to have an iOS app. And I think I'd love that to be an underpinning of sort of a bigger concept here. That was sort of calling it right now Remind. So it's this idea of RE, colon mind, But
I love
the
it.
idea is just,
Love it.
hey, regarding your mind, right? So this thing is something that we're all challenged with, and it could have a lot of different kinds of outputs. But ultimately, I think the goal of it is, how do we help shift someone's perspective in the right moment, in the right way, so that they can get to an outcome that's better and more specific faster.
Juan Carlos, it's so great to have you with us today. Thanks for making the time. Thanks for being here. Henrik Wardland, what stood out to you from our conversation with Juan Carlos?
Jeremy, oddly, I'm glad you asked. The thing that really stood up to me is this idea that you could ask ChatGPT to direct yourself, that you kind of like do this kind of whole reverse prompt and how powerful that can become. It's just fascinating saying, hey, I'd like to do X. Please direct me on how I do it. And then as long as you're okay kind of taking a few blind alleys and kind of going back, then you could probably do pretty much whatever you want to do.
Yeah, I love that. To me, one of the things that stood out is we've unlocked the ability for anyone who's had this question of what they've always wanted to see in the world. Now they have the ability to actually manifest it with ChatGPT's guidance. And just like you're saying, we often think about ourselves guiding ChatGPT. We can also put ChatGPT in the position of a smart engineer that's willing to take time with me. The other thing that stood out to me was his kind of hack around journal entry and actually pulling out one's own cognitive bias by basically asking ChatGPT to diagnose your cognitive bias by analyzing the verbiage that you use to describe a situation in a journal entry. I think that's such a illuminating practice that we could all do right now and probably get a lot of wisdom from that. So I'm going to go do the journal entry prompt.
And while Jeremy does that, I'll take the opportunity to sign off on today's episode. I hope you found it interesting to figure out how you might be able to build an iPhone app just using GPT. And with that, thank you so much for listening. And if you liked it, as always, we really appreciate it if you could share with somebody who might also like it, or rate it 5 stars on the various streaming platforms, like and subscribe and all that stuff. Until next time.